Yo, what's up, guys? This is Simon. How's everybody doing? Today is March 11th. It's Wednesday. Today, I guess I'm just gonna have a casual talk with all of you guys. Haven't done this kind of format before, so if you guys like it, definitely hit the thumbs up button, or if you want, you can leave us some message under the comment section. If all of you guys like this kind of format, maybe in the future we can do more this kind of stuff. Okay, so let's move on. So today's topic is about immigration policy. So if you have been following Chinese related news, then you know recently the Ministry of Justice Department has released a new draft of the permanent resident policy, and they put the whole thing on the internet and request society for comments. Unfortunately, the majority of Chinese people don't like it, and it even sparked huge backlash on the internet. So originally, I didn't pay too much attention on that issue. I didn't even know the Ministry of Justice Department have issued a new draft until I think it was last week when I was scrolling on my Weibo, which is Chinese version of Twitter. Then I found somebody talking about it. People start complaining about the draft. They think that the new draft was too lenient, which allows virtually every single foreigners can get one, and also it gives even more benefits to foreigners than average Chinese people. The most interesting part for me is that this time the angriest people are actually the pro-government nationalists who usually stand with the government, but this time they looks really pissed off and they swarm into all those comment section and post very controversial comments such as, hey, we need to protect our Chinese women against all those foreigners, or like Europe are in huge trouble because of their bad immigration policy, so we shouldn't follow their footstep, or something more controversial such as China only belongs to the Chinese, no other race shall be allowed to stay in China. Now, I'm not going to name every single popular comments on the internet because some of them are just too controversial, too xenophobic. So let's just move on. First of all, I think if we want to talk about this new draft, we need to take a look into the old one. So I think the old one is indeed very strict. Now, if you have been living in China for a while, you know it is virtually impossible for an average foreign Joe to get a green card in China. Yes, China does issue a green card, but it's virtually impossible for like average people to get one. I think you either need to be like super rich who has invested a ton of money in China, or either you need to be a very renowned scientist or professors, or you need to be a famous athlete. I think so far there are only like a few thousand people who actually got that permanent residency in China since the program has started. I know one of the NBA players, Stephen Marbury, he got one, and also Elon Musk was offered one last time he visited China. I think the Chinese Prime Minister actually offered him personally. I don't know if he take it. He probably got it. I don't know. So if you think you are one of these guys, maybe you can get one as well. But definitely for the majority of like average people working in China as a living, then definitely it's pretty tricky for them to get one. Almost impossible, I guess. And even if you are married to a Chinese citizen, it's still not gonna be good enough for you to get a green card. So you will be on a spouse visa, which won't allow you to work. So if you find a job and if you want to work in China, then you have to switch to a work visa. And then if you want to quit your job and keep staying in China, then you have to switch back to a spouse visa. So a lot of paperwork, a lot of time has been wasted. It's not very convenient. So yes, the current system is definitely not foreigner friendly. I think that's one of the main reasons why the government want to release the new draft. And the second reason why the government want to release the new draft is that it's the 21st century. If China want to be more competitive in the future and to stay a very healthy economy, eventually we will need better human resource from the outside. If you take a look at our population pyramid of China, you will find some problem over there. So for the past 30 years, because of the one-child policy, the majority of Chinese families are only allowed to have one child, or technically one child, but Some family in the rural place, they still, find a way to have 2 or 3, but generally speaking, this policy has caused a very low birth rate in China for the last 30 years, which in the beginning might be a good thing because it saves us a ton of resource food to feed all those population, right? But in the future, it is also problematic because maybe in the next 20 years or 30 years, just based on that population pyramid, we will have fewer and fewer workforce compared to the retired population. So if we want to sustain that robust economy to feed all those retired people, then eventually we need to have a large enough workforce to sustain all of that, right? Although the government has already lifted the one-child restriction, but unfortunately a lot of people, they just don't want to have kids. I mean, a lot of my friends or schoolmates, they only want to have one or even don't want one at all because people are just getting used to this kind of, one single child family because we were all raised in a single child family and we feel that's perfectly fine. Why we need to have 2, right? And also people are just more self-centric, so we would rather to spend more time on traveling, going to school or like finding a better job instead of taking care of kids. So if younger generation doesn't want to have more kids, then eventually inevitably we will need to borrow workforce from outside. I think the government also are aware of that. So that's why the government want to come up with a more lenient permanent resident policy to attract people to stay in China, work in China. And I think all of you guys, if you lived in China, you also want the same thing, right? If you want to plan to stay here for a long run, you want to have that policy as well. But unfortunately, the new draft just got rejected by the majority of Chinese people. Like I mentioned before, some people have complained that the policy is too easy for foreigners to get one and also give more benefits to the foreigners. So I took a look into the draft, and personally I think there are some problem here and there, and which they can be solved maybe quite easily, but there are some very huge conflicts. I don't think the Ministry of Justice Department can solve it by themselves. Now, let me just name some of them for you guys. Now, the first thing you need to know is that China strictly controls its foreign exchange. So every single year, every single citizen is only allowed to exchange a certain amount of foreign exchange, and that amount is 50,000 US dollars. So each year you are only allowed to exchange 50,000 US dollar worth of like foreign exchange, no matter what kind of foreign currency you want. The total amount is 50,000 US dollar, and if you use that up, then there's no more for you this year. You either like wait for another year or you can borrow someone else's credit. So take me as an example. Last time before I visited Taiwan, I want to change some Taiwan dollars. So first of all, I need to make a reservation on the internet, and the very next day I will need to go to a certain bank and then show my ID to the staff over there. Then the staff will check my ID, see how much foreign exchange I have left, and then they will exchange Taiwan dollar for me. If I use them up, then I will not be allowed to change any Taiwan currency. So a lot of like overseas Chinese students, when they will need to spend a lot of money, if they have used up their like credit, they have to borrow their parents' credit or their like good friends' credit and ask them to change some foreign currencies such as US dollar or like Canadian dollar and then send them overseas. So that's a policy that is strictly implemented in China. So some of you may ask, like, how does this policy have anything to do with the permanent resident policy, right? Yes, it definitely have a relation, because every single Chinese citizen follow that restriction or this kind of policy, the foreign exchange control policy. If the foreigners come here, become a permanent resident, well, the permanent resident also follow that same restriction. So there are two options. The government also will implement that restriction to the permanent residency as well. then the permanent residency all of a sudden doesn't feel like very attractive, right? Because each year you can only like send a certain amount of money outside of China, then all of a sudden you feel like you are controlled by China. And I know a lot of foreigners, although they want to live here long term, but they don't want to make that commitment. Some of them maybe have families living overseas, and they want to, you know, send money to support their families as well, right? On the other side, the government can also lift that restriction, which is suggested in the draft. However, it will piss a lot of Chinese people, because Chinese people will be like, hey, we are the citizen over here, we got so many restrictions, and why those foreigners, they come here and they become the permanent residency, why don't they need to follow the same restriction? That's just not fair. That's a freaking double standard, right? And it will also cause another issue, that is a lot of rich Chinese people, what they're gonna do is that they're gonna go to overseas and get a foreign passport and dump their Chinese passport, and then come back to China and get a foreign resident. Then all of a sudden they don't have to follow that restriction anymore. They can send as much money as they want outside of China. They will create just another huge issue here. So you see, the Ministry of Justice Department, I don't think they can sort that thing out by themselves, right? And the second issue is the hukou issue in China. Now, well, hukou issue is actually quite difficult to explain to you guys. I think it only exists in China. I don't know if anywhere else actually have a similar policy. So basically, hukou issue is a Chinese like residency policy. So take me as an example. I'm from Shanghai, so my residency is in Shanghai, which allows me to work in Shanghai, live in Shanghai, buy an apartment in Shanghai, and get a mortgage, and also enroll me into the welfare system in Shanghai. But let's say I have an imaginary like cousin who is from a third and fourth tier city, and his residency obviously is from that city, right? He can come to Shanghai, he can work here, he can live here without any issue, but he cannot buy an apartment in Shanghai, and it is going to be extremely difficult for him to get a mortgage, and his kids won't be able to go to public school in Shanghai because he doesn't have the Shanghai residency. Although he can try to apply for the Shanghai residency, but it will usually take him about 4 to 5 years depending on his background. And I think there are a score system, so like every qualification will give you certain score. I think like if you graduate from a, let's say, very renowned university, you will get like maybe 20 or 30 score here, and if you work for like more than 5 years, it give you another 10 or 20 score over there. So once you pass that score, and you can get a Shanghai residency, and then after that you can, you know, transfer your kids from the school in your hometown to Shanghai. If you have been living in China for a fairly long time, you will observe this kind of phenomenon, like a huge group of Chinese people, they are from like third or fourth tier city, then they move to the first tier city for work, but because they cannot get the residency over there, they have to left their kids back in their hometown for education. So that's what happens over here. So generally speaking, the hukou policy will limit people's movement. For instance, although I'm from Shanghai, I can buy an apartment here, but one day if I want to find a job in Beijing, then I don't have a residency over there, so it's gonna be tricky for me to buy an apartment in Beijing and also join the welfare system over there. And if I have kids, maybe I have to leave them in Shanghai because I don't have a Beijing residency, right? So my kids cannot join a public school over there. So basically, the hukou issue will limit the free movement within China. So now the problem is whether the permanent residents should also follow that policy, right? It's also a pretty hard situation for the government to choose, because if the government chooses to let the permanent resident also follow that issue, then the permanent residency will not be very attractive, because we know foreigners are more volatile, they tend to move a lot. Let's say if you working in a third tier city in China, and then you get a permanent resident in China, is that permanent residency will only allow your children to, go to school in that third tier city, or it will give you full access to all the public school in China? We need to answer that question, right? Because if the government give you access to all the public school in China, then it will create some issue, because Chinese citizen doesn't have that luxury. We are limited to the residency we have. On the other side, if the government apply the same rule to those permanent residency holder, then it's just gonna make the permanent resident less attractive, right? Because if you move to another place, should you also like spend all those time and efforts to apply for a residency in another region? That just sounds stupid. I mean, in the United States, once you get a green card, you are permanent residency over there, then you can, virtually work anywhere you want, and your kids can also move with you and go to school in other places, right? But in China, Chinese citizen doesn't have that luxury. Should the government give those permanent residents that kind of, benefits? If they give them, every citizen will flip out. But if they don't give them, the residency card just doesn't sound as attractive as any other places, right? Those two issues are just the one I thought about, and there are some other issues such as, so right now in China, it took about 6 to 7 years for a student who have a doctorate degree to get a Beijing residency card. But in the current draft, foreigners only need like 5 years to get a permanent residency card in Beijing. So that's also quite unfair for the Chinese citizen, right? Now, there are also some other issues which isn't that big. For instance, like in China, we have like foreign school and domestic school. Domestic school are for like citizens in China, and foreign schools are only designed for like foreigners. So if you are not a foreigner in China, if you don't have like foreign passport, your kids are not allowed to go to those foreign schools. And at the same time, foreign kids are not allowed to go to those public schools in China. But now we have like permanent resident, right? And if those foreigners become permanent residents, so their kids are supposed to be able to go to public school, which is the domestic school in China, right? So that shouldn't be an issue, because you become a permanent resident, then of course you are part of the family and you should be allowed to go to the domestic school here. But however, because Chinese people are not allowed to go to foreign school, so it just makes people feel like foreigners have more choice. If they have permanent residency, then their kids are able to either go to domestic school or foreign school. But Chinese citizens over here, they have like less choice, because they are only allowed to go to domestic school. So it also creates some like unfair practices, right? But I think they can solve that issue quite easy, because they just like let the domestic kids to choose whether they want to go to a public school here, or they want to go to a foreign school by like paying some extra money, right? That shouldn't be an issue. I'm not going to name every single issues created by the draft. First of all, I agree that there are some flaws in the draft, but essentially I think if we really need to make the citizen happy and also make the draft as attractive as possible, then I think instead of stripping off all those benefits for the permanent residency, why don't we just give more benefits or rights to the citizens, so in that way maybe we can satisfy both sides, right? If you take a look at other developed countries like Canada, like Australia, United States, the big difference between citizen and green card holder is that citizen can vote and got elected, but the permanent residency, they are just merely resident, right? They don't get right to vote. They are not involved in making the decision for the future of the country, and I think that's the way we should take. The big difference between citizen and a resident is that the citizen should be involved in making the decision of the country. We are the owner of the country. We should be able to making the rule for the country and making changes instead of stripping off all those benefits we gave to the permanent resident, we should try to give more rights and benefits to the citizen here in China, right? But the issues I mentioned before is still quite tricky to solve. I mean, currently, China strictly controls its foreign exchange. It's virtually impossible to just lift that restriction and let everybody to send money overseas freely, or either, completely cancel the hukou issue, because we only have limited resource here. And if you just cancel that restriction, for sure, like a lot of people from the first tier city will flip out, right? So in the short term, I don't think there is a very easy way to solve that. In the end, they might just adopt the same restriction from the citizen for permanent resident holders. So I think that's the only way. It might make the permanent residency card less attractive, but at least the government probably don't want to piss off like 1.4 billion population, right? So yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. It's my first time doing this kind of format. I don't know if the whole thing makes sense. Alright guys, I think that's pretty much it. What do you guys think about the permanent resident policy in China? Please leave a comment. Yep, I think that's pretty much it. Once again, thank you so much for everyone's support and love. I will see you guys next time, okay? Peace.